Thank you. Yeah, that shows the repression against the Buddhists by law, by repression, by brutality in many different ways. The next community we're going to hear from is the Montagnard, who suffered very serious repression in Vietnam, and we're really very happy to have a speaker who I think is one, I told her, she's the best. She's Sara Colm is the specialist on Southeast Asia. She's lived in Cambodia, she's worked for over 20 years, and she's really somebody who's taken to heart the problems of the Montagnard peoples, and she's been one of the basic voices, the most vocal people to bring this to the fore. Sara Colm is, she was from 1992 to 2011. She was based in Cambodia, where she served as human rights monitor for the UN peacekeeping mission, advisor to Cambodian and international human rights organizations, and consultant. And she is now a consultant and independent researcher for Amnesty International and the campaign to abolish torture in Vietnam. And as I say, we're very honored that she's come a long way to be here today. So thank you, Sara. The floor is yours.
Greetings. Thank you very much. Thank you for your wonderful introduction. So I'm going to be talking about the repression of Montagnard Christians in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, and Tony will talk about the Hmong in the Northwest Highlands after me. I think that it's, in looking at the question as to why are Montagnard Christians so severely repressed in Vietnam, it's useful to look back a little bit at the history, and I'll do a quick review for you. During the colonial regime, the French brought in some Catholic priests, and people throughout Vietnam began to slowly convert to Catholicism, followed in the early 20th century, around 1911, by missionaries from the CMA, which is the Christian and Missionary Alliance, introducing Christianity formally into Vietnam. And as a result of CMA's efforts, the Evangelical Church of Vietnam was founded in 1927, initially with only a little more than 4,000 members. A couple of years after that, in 1929, 1930, CMA began working in the Central Highlands. They had some centers in Buôn Ma Thuột, in Dak Lak, and in Pleiku. And over the years, the numbers of Montagnards who converted from their traditional beliefs, which were more along the lines of animism or respect and worshiping spirits in nature and ancestor spirits, Montagnards many of them began to convert to Christianity. By 1975, throughout Vietnam, there were about 200,000 evangelical Christians, of whom 1/3 were estimated to be minority people from the mountains, from either the Central Highlands or the Northwest Highlands. And this growth continued to sort of dramatically increase over time, so that by 1975, with the change in the government, there's a dramatic effort to close down this movement by imprisoning pastors, by closing churches, by being very restrictive about the practice of Christianity in the Highlands, as well as throughout Vietnam. During the 80s and the 90s, there was sort of a quiet movement, house churches. People were quietly continuing their religion when they could by sort of secretly practicing the religion in their homes with just very few people. This house church movement grew despite the harassment and threats by the government, and to the point where it was a significant movement in the late 80s and early 90s. By 2000, 2001, there were estimated to be more than 1 million evangelical Christians in Vietnam, of whom more than half were Montagnards in the Central Highlands. So that's a very dramatic growth where, at this point, if you look at from 1975 to now, the numbers of Montagnard Christians have essentially quadrupled, 4 times the amount in 1975. So this is a significant population, it's a significant sort of movement in Vietnam. And so I want to just talk now about sort of the waves of repression in the last 20 years or so by the government against Montagnard Christians. And I think something that also needs to be taken into account when discussing the history is that during the 70s and 80s, the Montagnards had an armed resistance movement called Fulro. Many of the Fulro members were Christians. They were fighting against the government as a guerrilla movement. That movement died out as a fighting force in 1992 when the last of the Fulro fighters were airlifted out of their jungle hiding places in Cambodia. So this is important to sort of understand when looking at Montagnard Christianity, because when Fulro was taken out as a fighting force, when it was no longer a force in Vietnam, at that same time the popularity of Christianity amongst Montagnards began to grow even more. And in a sense, it was a non-violent sort of movement for religion and for ethnic pride as well, by having their own churches and wanting to control their own affairs. So in around 2000, an activist Montagnard movement, which has been called Dega Christianity, or in Vietnamese would be Tin Lan Dega, emerged in the Central Highlands. And this movement, it was a religious movement, but it also had combined the evangelical Christianity with aspirations for greater political freedom, for protection of ancestral lands, and for some autonomy or self-rule. So it's a political and a religious movement that were combined. And in 2001, less than a year later, there were massive demonstrations by Montagnards in 4 provinces of the Central Highlands. Can you hear me still? Sure. Calling for religious freedom and greater land rights. The government's response was extremely harsh. Tanks were brought in, military were dispatched to the region, hundreds of people were arrested, many more fled to Cambodia as refugees. And the government at that time since that time has alleged that the form of Montagnard Christianity, is Tin Lan Dega, they say is not a religion. It's not a real religion, they say. They say that it is actually a guise for a political movement, a separatist political movement. And it's been a long, this rationale has been used to close down hundreds of churches, to imprison hundreds of Montagnards throughout the last 16 years on charges that they are Tinlan Dega and or Fulro, even though there's no evidence that Fulro or any armed movement continues amongst the Montagnards in the Central Highlands. And even though the Montagnards themselves advocate peaceful change regarding their land rights and their human rights. So I wanted to share with you some things that some Montagnard Christians told me when they fled from Vietnam to Cambodia. I've interviewed hundreds of Montagnards. I was based in Cambodia for almost 20 years. And people crossing the border told me why they fled, and they also told me about their religion, their religious beliefs. One old man told me, before we had religion, meaning Christianity, before we had religion, we were ignorant. We were in the dark. We drank wine and did not know about our land. Then we saw the light and realized our rights were being violated. We realized our land was being confiscated, our ethnicity crushed and destroyed. That's why the Vietnamese government prohibits our religion. Many people told me, I would say, what is the difference between Tinlan, evangelical Christianity, and Tinlan Dega? And it was really hard to get a clear answer. Some people who had been arrested and accused of being Tinlan Dega never called themselves that. They had never even heard of it. Whereas those who'd heard of it, they would say the difference is that Tinlan Dega and Tinlan, they're not much different. One comes from America, that's Tinlan, and then Tinlan Dega is from us Montagnards ourselves. But basically it's one religion with two parts. So they're basically wanting to manage their own religion, like many other religious groups in Vietnam. And they say that Tinlan is a religion that preaches harmony and for people to think about our ancestral land. So these are pretty mild goals. These are not goals to overthrow the government violently. They are really voicing their wishes to manage their own religious activities. I would say that, when asked about the question of are Tinlan Dega, are they seeking a separate state? Some are, yes, for sure. But others, they are talking about, I want my land back. I used to have a coffee field, and it's gone. I have no way to support my family. I want my patch of land back. Others may say that they would like to have some control over their religious groups or their localities, whereas others go so far as to say that they want a separate state. But, all of this is advocated peacefully, and I think that one of the issues, one of the problems that U.S. government policy has fallen into is in distinguishing between the good Montagnards who agree to go to churches under the recognized Evangelical Church of Vietnam South, and those who don't agree. And in many cases, U.S. government policy has fallen into the trap of basically agreeing with Vietnamese government policy by stating that the Montagnards they're separatists, the Tinlan Dega, they are separatists, we are not going to put them on our list. We'll take the ones who are ECVN recognized pastors, a much smaller number. Both groups should be on the U.S. government's list of prisoners of conscience. And the U.S. government should not be staying clear of people who simply advocated nonviolently for their political and religious ideas. So I mentioned there were large demonstrations in 2001, which resulted in many hundreds of people arrested and fleeing to Cambodia. There were demonstrations again in 2002, in 2004, in 2008, and maybe, for sure, other demonstrations that no one has ever heard of, because the Central Highlands is a very closed area. It is very difficult for independent press or human rights researchers to gain access to the Central Highlands. And when events happen in the Central Highlands, it's rarely covered in the international media. It's very, very difficult. So, for example, how many people here know that on August 30th, just a couple of weeks ago, 2 Dega Christians were sentenced to prison, 11 years and 8 years. So it's a couple of weeks ago. There's no outcry, there's no press, there's no names, there's very little attention paid to this. They were accused of being Tinlan Dega and being Fulro. Why does the government always accuse people of being Tinlan Dega and Fulro? Because it's written into the law. The laws that were passed as reform measures resulting from the dialogue between the U.S. government and Vietnam, the laws in 2005 specifically outlawed legalization of churches who are Tinlan Dega or who have connections to Fulro. So when you look at the Vietnamese newspaper articles from the state press, that is the accusation for everyone at Tinlan Dega and Fulro. So now there's a Catholic group that is becoming very popular in the Central Highlands called Hamon, after the place where it was founded. Hundreds of people have joined the Hamon Catholics. That group has also had an activist background because they have opposed the displacement of villagers in Canton for a dam, for a hydropower project. So the government is arresting many of these people and having trials of them in the villages to sort of scare the villagers from joining Hamon, and is saying that they too are connected to Fulro and Tinlan Dega. So they put it all in the same box. I think I'll stop here with just one more point. In terms of the Catholics who are now under pressure in the Central Highlands, the Hamon Catholics. If you want to know about this, you just read the Vietnamese official media. It's all there. Recently, there was a 2-year campaign to eradicate Hamon Catholicism in Yalai province, in 4 districts. And so I'm just going to tell you what the official press in Vietnam, I think it was probably the police newspaper, they said, over 2 years, in order to eliminate, to destroy Hamon Catholicism, we held more than 120 meetings to mobilize 12,000 people. We brought 144 subjects before public review. In your village, you are called before the entire village and you are criticized. You are forced to confess to wrongdoing. You are made to swear your allegiance to the party and to renounce your religion. This led to 74 people who had been in hiding were discovered by the authorities. 534 people voluntarily abandoned Hamon Catholicism. In addition, the police, in cooperation with centrally directed Central Highlands Mobile Police Regiment, mobilized 2,500 soldiers and officers to conduct 85 raids. This led to the apprehension of 38 Corps personnel and destroyed the 25 underground toll road networks who were using hormone Catholicism, and re-educated 148 Corps subjects. I mean, these kind of statistics are often in Vietnamese police newspaper accounts because they want to sort of describe how they are feeling, completing government campaigns to eradicate these types of religions. So it's all there right in the press. Finishing off with just some recommendations. Of course, the recommendations that USURF makes and that Vietnam Committee for Human Rights makes, Montagnard Human Rights Organization, and Sara Colm, all those recommendations are very good regarding eliminating rigorous registration requirements and putting pressure on Vietnam. I would also just underscore the importance of not focusing solely on religious freedom to the detriment of people who are religious freedom activists or who are human rights defenders who are trying to get assistance to the families of Montagnard prisoners, or people who are even calling for greater land rights when they meet to pray. It's important not to separate those people out because they're the ones who are really the unseen victims. They're the people who are languishing in Vietnamese prisons. According to the numbers that I have, there are at least 175, 200 Montagnards who remain in prison, and that's a large number and is rarely ever mentioned by U.S. government when they meet with Vietnam specific people. Thank you very much.